Welcome to Working It Out with Dr. V. Today's guests are the incomparable Iyanla Vanzant of Iyanla Fix My Life on the Open Network, HR expert Solange Fleming with co-host Norman Bailey.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. With Dr. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. With Dr. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out. Dr. V.
I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, known as Dr. V, and I'm your host of Working It Out. As many of you know, I'm a trained clinical psychologist, but what I do in my day job is to really function as a coach, working with organizations and the people in them to deal with what we call some of the workplace drama and the stress that it creates. So we realized, as I thought about the show and why the show, we realized that many of you don't have a place to go to really deal with that job stress that's really derailing you. And oftentimes your people at home are tired of hearing it, or your friends are tired of hearing it, and you just really don't know where to go with it. And so you suffer in silence and often become what we call the walking wounded. So we designed Working It Out as really a safe place for you to come and get some free coaching and some advice and some perspective on how to deal with some of these crazy workplace dynamics, some of the workplace drama, and the stress that it causes you. So our intention is to have real talk about candid issues so that you leave feeling more empowered to really win at that job stress game than when you joined us on the call. So as part of our conversation here with you, I'm just really fortunate to have as a co-host Norman Bailey. And Norman has had decades, I don't want to date him, but he's had decades of working with individuals, particularly African Americans in the workplace, on issues around career and handling job stress. And so part of Norman's job is to provide for us some of that every person perspective, as well as to make sure I don't get too drawn into my psychobabble as a clinical psychologist. So Norm, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dr. V.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Part of our topic we want to talk about today is this whole notion of job stress,
right.
To kind of ground us as we continue our series of dealing with workplace drama here.
Okay.
And I've often been asked the question, Norman, do African Americans or Latinas deal with job stress differently than others? And so I was just wondering, from your perspective, having coached African Americans and Latinas in the workplace, what has been your experience?
Well, it's interesting to say that. What my observation has been over the years, and it's been pretty consistent, is that folks seem to tend to internalize it, especially I would say African Americans. Mm-hmm. And I'm not always sure what drives that as we kind of talk about it. I think some of it's been fear of, standing out more than they probably already feel they may stand out, depending on the culture and the dynamic in the workplace. But it's more of just trying to just hang in there and be kind of low key about it. Then that what I've seen means they don't really get their issue addressed. I mean, they take it outside to friends, family, wherever it may go, instead of to the people that maybe can help them. And that's what we try to do, to talk to them about how they put that in play in the workplace versus taking it outside.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective, Norman, and I really want to explore that a little bit more, because what we know is that job stress is an equal opportunity stressor.
Absolutely.
8 out of 10 people are stressed on their jobs each and every day.
Right.
And sometimes that stress is short-lived, and sometimes it's chronic.
Okay.
And when it gets chronic, it affects one's health, it affects one's mental attitude, their disposition. And in fact, we know like 40% of African American women indicate the job stress is the number one stressor in their life. Yeah. And it's a major derailer for them.
Wow.
And so not only are they dealing with that stress in the workplace, but they're taking it home.
Oh, yeah, we feel it.
Just so you feel it. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So I'm interested because I know that stress really is a function of people feeling like they can't control the outcome of a situation that they're in. Now, they can go to Webster and to some of the clinical manuals and get really some much more complicated definitions of it. But really, it's really when you feel like you don't control or you can't control what's impacting you.
Right.
And so, my question to you is, because you talked about as brothers, you feel the stress when sisters come home and they're stressed out. But, I was really wondering, how does the stress show up for black men?
Well, it's interesting again because what I've observed and talking, especially again black men over the years, is you'll find that it gets connected to something. You'll be having a conversation or just hanging out, and all of a sudden it kind of goes south, and you're trying to figure out, dude, what did I say?
Yeah.
And it reflects back to something that may have happened in the workplace, and now it comes forward. And so I found that sometimes in coaching session, I kind of got to go to these, it's like peeling the onion, these layers of external discussion to get down to what the core issue is.
So what you think you're looking at isn't necessarily what's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting because we were brought in to do an engagement with a client, Fortune 20 company.
Right.
And they were really concerned because the African American men in that organization were not moving past middle level.
Really? Wow.
And the client told us that they were technical geniuses. Many of them had patents.
Wow.
They clearly saw them as being technically sound and exceptional, so it wasn't an issue of competence.
Okay, brothers had it going on.
They had that going on,
All
but
right.
they really weren't showing up as leaders in the organization. And when I asked them, well, what does that look like, not showing up as leaders, they talked about the fact that they didn't really project passion. They didn't seem to be really committed to a particular position.
Wow.
Many times they said they just didn't show up in meetings. They were quiet or didn't even push their point of view. And when we interviewed the African American men, they had a totally different picture of how they showed up. I mean, they had it going on.
I'm about to say, they were talking, rocking, right?
Right. They had so much bravado, and they could tell you what they contributed, how many millions of dollars that it contributed to the business.
Right.
They felt good about what they were doing, and they felt that the organization was at fault.
I hear you.
Around why they weren't succeeding and getting promoted in the organization. So we figured somewhere between both of those perspectives, lay the truth.
Right.
And so what we did was to shadow the African American men for several days.
Okay.
And guess what, Norm?
What happened?
The description that their supervisors had of them is what we saw.
No.
We would see them in meetings. They would not speak up. Most of the time they didn't speak up. And when they spoke up, their voices were so soft that you had to strain to hear them.
Are you serious?
And when they talked about their contributions, they always talked about these contributions in the context of what the team did.
Gotcha.
So you never got the sense of how they led that contribution or that solution in the organization.
Right.
And so you could see in the course of those meetings how people were just kind of discounting them and dismissing them and just tuning them out.
Man.
So right in front of us, we saw this incredible dynamic, and we thought, well, we need to really have some conversations with this, with these, African American men to help them understand.
Now,
for us to figure out what was going on.
How did these brothers respond when you put this on?
Well, we're gonna get back to that.
Okay.
Because it was really phenomenal in terms of what we understood and what they began to see.
Gotcha.
That was causing this stress. Well, Norm, to help us get even a better perspective on that, we are fortunate to have as our celebrity guest today, Miss Iyanla Vanzant.
That's what I'm talking about.
Of Iyanla Fix My Life on the Oprah Network. Iyanla, we're so glad to have you, and we know that every week when you're doing your show, you're helping people deal with stressors, not only in the workplace, but in their personal life. So welcome, Iyanla.
Yeah. Stress will kill you.
Yeah.
I've discovered that personally. But what I've also discovered about stress is that it is a function of how you hold the experience in your own mind. What you think about it, how you approach it, how you see yourself contributing or not contributing will give rise to the level of stress that you experience. I work in a very stressful industry because it's all about trying to figure out what you want other people to think. So those who control the words and images control what goes on in the mind. And all stress begins in the mind.
We know, Iyanla, that's such a powerful statement in terms of all stress begins in the mind. Because I don't know if you had a chance to hear the previous dialogue that Norman and I were having about how the African American men were showing up, or for that matter, not showing up as leaders in their organization. And clearly, many of them had perceptions around what they could or couldn't do as black men in the organization.
That's right.
And that seemed to affect their behavior. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. And particularly when the organization does not clearly articulate what it is that they are expecting. See, there's a distinction between you have a job description and how we expect you to perform that job description. That second part rarely gets communicated in a way that the worker can live up to.
So you're saying that maybe the organization was giving these African-American men cues around how they expected them to show up, and therefore that's how they decided to deal with that?
I think that's part of it. I think that more African-American men, particularly in blue-collar jobs, and African-American women also, show up thinking the job is the way I'm going to get the money that I need to survive. So what do I need to do to survive? Not what do I need to do to demonstrate excellence and leadership and commitment to this position, which is actually what the employer is looking for.
Right.
So there's a separation in understanding and perception from the onset. I'm going to work because I need some money to pay my rent and feed my kids. So I'm going to show up when you tell me to show up. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And that's not to say that African Americans or people of color don't have a commitment to their job, but are they clear about what the employer will be looking at and measuring in terms of how they show up?
Well, Iyanla, that is such an important point, because what we're finding is that in these workplace situations between the supervisor and the African American, there's not a lot of straight talk around what is really expected. And so we can talk about it in terms of budget and schedule and deliverables, but we don't talk about those intangible elements like this leadership and what you're expected to do and how you're expected to show up in that way.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
if I can piggyback on what
I haven't worked for anybody other than God Incorporated probably in 30 years. But one of the things that I do remember from when I did work in the corporate corporate arena was one of the ways that the supervisors would cut you off at the knees is talk about attitude. Oh, your attitude. And you have this kind of attitude and that kind of attitude. Well, where is attitude in the job description?
Right. And I tell you, that attitude phrase is one of the major stressors that Norm and I have encountered when we're coaching people. They talk about, I have this attitude, and it's so nebulous.
Right. And see, my attitude is I'm coming to work because I need this money to
survive,
pay my bills, and take care of my children. I'm showing up on time. I'm doing what you tell me to do. Now, if you want me to smile and grin and bring donuts and, make everybody feel comfortable, that's not included in the job description. So my stress is from my approach to the position.
Okay, well, Iyanla, let me ask you this, because we got to take a commercial break, but I want you to hold on to that thought, that your stress is really tied to your approach to how they do their jobs.
Oh, we getting good now.
Yeah, it is good. I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, your host of Working It Out on HUR Voices, Sirius XM 141, and we'll be right back after this break and continue our conversation with Iyanla Vanzant.
Email your work-related questions to www.workingitout.com.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out.
Welcome back. I'm Dr. V, your host of Working It Out. And we're talking with the esteemed Iyanla Vanzant, and we're talking about workplace dynamics, i.e. workplace craziness, and how this shows up in job stress. And Iyanla left our session with a really interesting point. And she was talking about how one responds to stress and this connection in the mind. So, Iyanla, are you back here with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Finish that thought, and then Norman is over here chomping at the bit to say something.
Well, I think very often that we show up at work with a predisposed mindset of why we are there. We don't live in a society like, let's say, China, Japan, some places in India, where the employees have a vested interest in the success and the long-range goals and vision of the company. So I show up with the mindset of this is what I have to do every day to create what it is that I need to survive in the world. And clearly we know that very often what I'm working for doesn't even meet my needs. Mm-hmm. So I come to work with a certain mindset in a certain way, but that is not in alignment with what the organization may be expecting of me or requiring of me. And that word that we talked about, the attitude. Mm-hmm. There's a dichotomy between how I'm showing up and what you're expecting that is very rarely articulated. I'm here to get my money. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, and then I'm going home. But I want you to show up looking a certain way and being a certain way. Now, here's where it really breaks down. For all of those hundreds of thousands of employees who show up pleasantly, who are supporting the company, who are moving forward and never get acknowledged for doing that simply because of their position, simply because of the breakdown between the top of the company and the bottom of the company, because of the attitude of the supervisor who may or may not report this is a good employee, or the supervisor doesn't like the employee's attitude. There's a myriad of disconnections between the top and the bottom that go into how employees are evaluated, that leads to a misperception by the organization and a heightened level of stress for the employees.
Yeah, it seems like it's a lot of misassumptions that have not been tested,
right?
Or put voice to. So, Norman, what do you think?
If I can jump in there, is especially what raised for me is the word expectation, and I'm curious your thoughts. And how I would frame that is these uncommunicated expectations.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I mean? And so, with folk of color, what I hear in these sessions is, well, how am I supposed to read these folk mind?
Right.
If they ain't out there with their stuff. So what would you say to folk who kind of caught in that space up, and then that leads to the quote-unquote attitude?
That's right.
What you feeling about that?
Well, I think you hit it dead on the head. The unspoken expectations, the poorly communicated evaluation skills, and then remember that much of the stress in our job or in our work environment is created by the personal approach, the personal issues, the personal perspective of the people who are interacting. So you have a supervisor from hell.
Wow.
That you can never please. Perhaps this person is going through a divorce, or perhaps they have a wayward child, or perhaps they're just meaner than a wet cat because that's just who they are. Well, all of that gets mixed into this unspoken assessment and evaluation of the employee's work, which then looks like they can never do the right thing, and that creates stress.
Well, let me ask you this.
How many times have you heard a worker say, no matter what I do, it ain't enough,
right,
or they don't pay me enough, or they don't recognize what I do, I'm going to do just what I need to do to get by, right, because remember, I'm here to make my money, to pay my rent, and feed my kids.
Hello. Well, let me ask you this, Iyanla, to that point, because we talked about stress is really feeling like you're not in control of the outcome of the situation you're dealing with, and that generates stress. So what would be in the minute or so that we have left with you, and I'm so glad and so we feel so fortunate to have you here, what would you suggest to recommend? What would you suggest to recommend for this individual to do to get more empowered? I go into every situation every single day having done my own daily spiritual practice. I don't go anywhere. I don't start. I am clear about what I want to experience during the day, and that is my intention. That is my focus. So if I'm going into this day, I'm going to give peace. I'm going to have peace. So I'm going in. I'm going to give joy. I'm going to have joy. So you're saying for people to shift their own mental mindset about how they're going to approach that work environment before they leave out of their home. Absolutely. It takes a minute to get grounded. You can't get it when you get there. Oh, my goodness.
You have to get your own peace, huh?
That's right.
Gotcha.
And how does that help? I mean, so you have your own peace, then what? So you have your own peace, you're centered.
Easily triggered by the approach and the expectations of others. You're more able to engage in balanced communication. You don't get caught up in the office politics and the office shenanigans that often lead to more stress.
Okay.
When you go in with a clear control in your own mind and a clear intention for your own experience, it's much easier to navigate some of the things that cause you stress when you're just going in there to make your money to pay your bills.
Gotcha.
That's a really interesting point, because you're saying have a clear intention about what it is you want.
That's right.
And prepare yourself to really shape and really alter the conversations and navigate that workplace minefield in ways that help you win.
Yeah.
And I know we don't have time to discuss it now, but
We'd love to have you back.
On another occasion,
Okay.
we really need to look at the breakdown between supervisors and workers.
Absolutely.
When supervisors are of all one hue or a perspective, and the employees are of another hue.
Right, and we can't assume that you don't have stress if you're African American working for an African American boss.
Hey, sometime more.
No, we're not going to assume that either. Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you for the time that you provided us today. You've been awesome, as you always are. And we are going to continue looking at Iyanla Fix My Life on the Oprah Network.
That's the one.
So thank you so much for coming, and I want to take you up on your offer to come back
Anytime.
and be part of our show. Thanks,
Anytime.
Iyanla.
Thank you.
Well, I tell you, this has been a robust conversation, and we really have a lot more to talk about. And in our 30 minutes, maybe not a lot.
We did another half hour.
Right. But part of what we intend to do, and Iyanla talks a lot about intention, but part of our intention is also to make sure that with every session, you walk away clear about not only what the issues are, but really what are your rights and what are your benefits and what are the privileges that you have as a person in the workplace. Well, I'd like to introduce you to Solandra Fleming, who is an HR expert, and we would like to get Solandra's take on the conversations we've had about this job stress, and then also to get some tips from Solandra around how you can become more empowered in dealing with your own stress from an HR perspective. Solandra.
Thank you, Dr. V, and hi, Norman.
Hey,
Hi, Solandra.
Thank you for having me. Yes, I think this has been a very, very dynamic and fruitful conversation. We can have 20 or 30 more sessions on this topic because it's very rich. It's a deep experience that we have, and we spend a lot of time at work. So it's important that we're successful and that we're comfortable and that we have the awareness that we need to function well in the workplace so that we perform. I would say people come to work to do a good job. No one wants to come to work and do a bad job.
Well.
And so I think that one of the things that stood out for me in the conversation prior to my coming on was this whole concept of performance management. And most organizations have a process, a formal process for performance management, but it's usually mismanaged. And there's usually not enough conversations around how one is doing in the workplace so that people know how they're doing and they don't get the feedback that they need.
Right.
So when you talk about feedback, because we know when doing the coaching with organizations, particularly people of color, African Americans, Latinos, women, is that they often say they don't get the feedback until it's too late. And by the
Right.
time they get it, it's not very helpful.
Right.
So what can an individual do to empower themselves to get feedback early enough and specific enough
Right.
to really address if there's an issue or the opportunity?
Right, that's a great question. I encourage employees in that I work with to initiate the conversation. They should check in with their manager, and there should be a two-way communication, not always just initiated by the manager, to sit down and say, how am I doing? I know some people who set up very short weekly meetings with their manager to say, how is this going? How am I doing? I felt uncomfortable with this. How did you feel about it? It's really about engaging on an ongoing basis so that you can start to bring into your available pool of conversation things that were not previously said, so that when what is uncomfortable now starts to be very comfortable because you're doing it all the time.
Okay, so it's to practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, it was interesting when you talked about that feedback, because we talked about how can a person feel empowered. And what I heard you say is that if, in fact, you initiate the feedback, make it easy for the supervisor to give you feedback, or
Yes.
others. It's not just the supervisor, but your peers.
Absolutely.
It might be even your secretary that works for you, but make it easy for people to give you feedback. That's the way of really dealing with some of those unspoken expectations.
Right.
Or fears around how people are perceiving you.
Absolutely. And an employee has the the ability and the power to help create a culture of ongoing feedback so that it's not just the manager who needs to initiate that conversation, because I, as an employee, have a vested interest in knowing how well I'm doing from my supervisor's eyes. So it's in my best interest to speak up and say, hey, I would love your feedback. Tell me how I'm doing. Give me something constructive that I can work on, so that they know you're interested in excelling on the job, and there's not the unspoken perceptions or misunderstandings about how you feel about being in the workplace.
That's largely in that feedback process. I'm curious, would you see it as the same window of opportunity for the employee to give some feedback? I mean, because I hear the feedback getting about there, but they may say, hey, Joe, if you stop doing this, or Sally, if you stop doing that, maybe I can do that.
Right.
But what do you say to somebody with that issue?
I'm a big proponent of it. There's a stop, start, continue model that we use in performance management, and it really should be on both sides.
Okay.
Stop, start, continue. This is what's helpful. Continue to do that. This is what should end, and then continue to do those things. And it helps to give a balanced feedback so that the conversation is not all negative and it's not all positive.
Okay. Well, Solandra, one of the reasons that we're excited that you're part of our Working It Out team is that you have a lot of perspective and a lot of tips to share. So we're going to continue on this feedback discussion in our next session. But unfortunately, we are at our 30 minutes almost.
It just flies.
Where did time go?
Really flies, I tell you. Maybe we're going to get an hour show here eventually.
Oh, yeah, we got to do this.
But I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, and I have with me Norman Bailey and Solandra Fleming. And we talked a lot today about job stress. Norman, take 30 seconds and tell us what were the 2 points that really stood out for you today?
2 quick ones for me, going back to Iyanla, and that is that, uncommunicated expectations. I think that's important. And then what Solandra just shared about the possibility of that two-way feedback.
That start-stop continuum.
Exactly. And that's sum that up. You really talk about something, how do we build better workplace relationship? When we start talking about two-way communication. So that's where I'm at.
It's all about the relationships, right, and how much we invest on both sides. It's this push-pull.
Yes.
Where the employee is pushing, but you need the organization. Solandra talked about the culture, to create a culture that really pulls that individual in and allows for that feedback and clarifying unanticipated expectations or unclear expectations.
Exactly.
Well, we only have a few seconds to go, and I'm Dr. V, your host of Working It Out. And next week, we're going to focus on my job is making my personal life miserable.
No, you didn't.
We talked a little bit about that earlier. The people take either you're working or you're thinking about work or you're taking your work home. And people are being impacted with that. So we're going to talk about that in our next show. And we invite you to visit our website, because on our website, we'll have Solandra Start, Stop, and Continuum there, and we'll also have some articles and some quizzes that you can take to get a sense of how you're being impacted by job stress. So on behalf of my team, Norman and Solandra, and thank you, Iyanla, this is Dr. V on Working It Out on HUR Voices, Sirius XM, Channel 141. Have a safe and productive week.
Share your work-related issues with Dr. V. Send them to www.workingitout.com.